you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Hello, welcome to Parrot TV's Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering, and we're with my co-host, Carlo Parcelli, frequent guest, Billy Bob. Today we have special guest, Chris Black. He is an international policy expert, and I'll let him introduce himself a little bit, tell us a little bit about what his knowledge is in, and we'll talk a little bit about the convergence of Rwanda, Syria, and Yugoslavia, and how this kind of relates to the current foreign policy decisions of the United States, and where this is going to hopefully head in the future. So let's let Chris introduce himself and tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. And then thanks for joining us on the show today.
You're very welcome. If the camera can see my face fairly, I'm not sure how I'm positioned, but I'm Christopher Black. I'm an international criminal lawyer based in Toronto, Canada, and I've been a lawyer for about 44 years now. For the last 22 years, I've been involved with mainly war crimes, starting with defending one of the people that defended President Milosevic of Yugoslavia at the ICTY, the Yugoslav or Hague Tribunal. But most of my time was spent at the Rwanda War Crimes Tribunal, which is associated with the Hague Tribunal, defending the Rwandan chief of staff of the Rwandan National Police, the Gendarmerie, during what they call the genocide in 1994. General Ndindilimana, who was charged with about 45 counts of genocide and war crimes and was acquitted fully in 2014. Also on the defense counsel list at the International Criminal Court, and I'm a member of the Canadian Peace Congress. Otherwise, I've been involved most of my life in left-wing politics and movements and peace movements and movements for social and economic justice in Canada here.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being on the show today. So I'll let Carlo and Billy Bob, if you guys have questions and you wanted to open up the conversation a little bit, let's see what you guys have to say.
Yeah, I'd like to start if that's all right.
Sure, go ahead.
Carlo, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So what I think would be great is to get Chris's expertise. So with, the issue of Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Western citizens, we have passively absorbed a particular narrative, a particular understanding. And I'm really curious to hear what Chris might have to say about, how his perception of the reality of those events is different from, the common understanding that has been indoctrinated into all of us Western citizens. And, Yugoslavia, it's kind of bizarre. I remember at the time I was trying to figure out what's going on. And, I know the U.S. is the good guys, but what, how can I get excited about what we're doing for good? And I tried to read about it and none of it made sense. Yeah. But there was a particular narrative that was put out there that wasn't that compelling anyway. And then Rwanda is obviously, it was the Hutu genocide of the Tutsi minority and, 800,000 dead. And it was basically black and white, the evil, Hutus against the good Tutsis. So I'm thinking that Chris might have some insight and can provide some a more deep analysis of those two events. And then and we can talk about Ukraine. That's what I was thinking. Carlo, did you have something you wanted before?
That's fine. I had a much more jaundiced view of the Yugoslav situation and the U.S. role in it, as I did with the situation in Rwanda and the Congo. But I'm older than you are, so I would love to hear what Chris has to say about this.
All right. I'll start with Yugoslavia. I mean, we all were faced with the same sort of intense propaganda against President Milosevic and the Serbs in Yugoslavia in 1999, and even before that. And both Rwanda and the Yugoslav situation arise out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Soon in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States and its allies in NATO immediately began a full court press to seize control of the world. And in order to do that and encircle Russia and control Russia, although they had installed Yeltsin in power inside, was to finally destroy Yugoslavia, which was the last socialist state in Europe at the time. And they did that over a period of years from 1991 up through 1999 by instigating same sort of thing they've done in Ukraine, uprisings against the republics inside Yugoslavia, installing nationalist, sometimes Nazi, fascist regimes in Croatia, Muslim extremists in Bosnia, inciting the Kosovo Liberation Army in central Serbian province of Kosovo, Muslim groups, and using Osama bin Laden at the time to do that, to break up Yugoslavia, which they succeeded in doing. They left with a rump state of Serbia, Macedonia, I think Montenegro, which was left in 1999, still called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But the Serbs proved too strong for them, so they decided to create all these atrocity stories that Milosevic and his army were killing people, massacring people in Kosovo, and so on and so forth. It was all nonsense. None of it was true. But they convinced the mass public here to support a war against Yugoslavia, which started in March 1999. And all the NATO powers took part. Canada took part. And they bombed intensely Yugoslavia and all the cities and towns in Yugoslavia for 3 months. I think 78 days. And they did not succeed in touching the Yugoslav army or armed forces whatsoever, because they used very skillful camouflage techniques and their air defenses were very strong. And Yugoslav generals told me they shot down 140 NATO planes, including 6 Canadian. I'm not sure how many Americans, but they shot down stealth planes that the Americans claimed they couldn't shoot down, but they did. B-2 bombers, F-22, I think, F-21, or F-111, sorry. They also tried to, because they could not succeed in breaking their Yugoslav air defenses, they began bombing civilian infrastructure, hospitals, railway trains, civilian trains, bridges, hydro plants, electric plants, factories. You name it, they bombed it, and they killed tens of thousands of people. Used uranium-based bombs, which killed a lot of people afterwards from depleted uranium. But still, they could not break Yugoslavia. And as of June, they were at a loss as to what to do. And then suddenly you saw in June of 1999 that Milosevic and Yugoslav surrendered, basically. Now, what caused that if they weren't being touched, except in the civilian areas? What happened was Yeltsin sent his then Foreign Minister Chernomyrdin with the Finnish, I think, Foreign Minister Ahtisaari, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago, to deliver a message to Milosevic from the Americans. And he went to Belgrade, and I know people who attended this meeting. And he told Milosevic and everybody at the meeting that unless they surrendered, the United States intended to carpet bomb Belgrade with high-flying B-52s and will kill 500,000 people in 2 weeks. And unless they surrendered, that's what was going to happen. So Milosevic and his cabinet were faced with this prospect. So they went to Parliament and said, this is what we're faced with. Do we continue resisting and suffer this loss, these huge losses, or do we give up? And they voted to give up. And immediately Yugoslavia was occupied. At the same time, there were elections in Yugoslavia. Milosevic, we pretty well know, won those elections, but they organized a fascist putsch in Belgrade, overthrew the socialist regime, beat people, killed people, burned buildings, just like they did in Maidan, like they tried to do in Minsk in Belarus recently. And then Milosevic was hauled off in chains to The Hague, accused of war crimes, and then I'm convinced was murdered, poisoned there in 2006. So and by doing that, then they used Kosovo to establish Camp Bondsteel, which is the biggest American base in the world. And what they do there is not really known, but it seems to be part of the encirclement of Russia and was always intended to be such. It's curious to know that when 9/11 happened, and they accused Osama bin Laden of being involved in that, which he denied many times. I spoke to him. I visited Milosevic on my way to Rwanda, to Africa, and we discussed that. And he said, "I can't believe that Osama bin Laden would attack the United States." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, our intelligence service detected bin Laden working under American Army command in Kosovo as late as 1999. So why a few months later would he suddenly turn around and attack them? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever." Anyway, his quote was posted in some French newspapers. It was never made any American or other Western news. So, but before the main attack on Yugoslavia took place, the first NATO, that was the biggest, and Zelensky and all these people say that the Russian action in Ukraine is the biggest war event to take place in Europe since World War II. It was not. Yugoslavia was. We had a couple of thousand NATO planes attacking Yugoslavia constantly every day, hour on hour on hour. And the British tried to land in a couple of SAS regiments, which were detected and wiped out. So there was intense fighting. But we have to go back to Rwanda in 1994 to also examine what the Americans were doing, and Canadians and Belgians and British, because the Rwanda war is also totally different from what the narrative is expressed in the Western media. The Western media was this black and white, as you said, picture of one savage tribe attacking another, the Hutus attacking the Tutsis and trying to wipe them out. And that's not what happened at all. Rwanda was considered by Bill Clinton, he said in 1989, the Switzerland of Africa. It was one of the most progressive countries in Africa. It was a semi-socialist state, a one-party state. The ruling party was called the Movement for National Development. And it had allies from East Germany, North Korea, Russia, Cuba, but it also had West German, French, and Belgian assistance. So it was pretty eclectic in who it used for support. But it was a roadblock into the Congo for Canada, the United States, Britain, and other countries who wanted to exploit the resources of the Congo. They asked the President Habyarimana of Rwanda if they could use it to invade Congo and overthrow Mobutu, who they got fed up with it because he was beginning to turn to the Chinese. They'd installed him in power after they killed Lumumba, but he was now starting to play games with the Chinese. They didn't like that, so they wanted to throw him out. They needed a way to get in to Congo, and that was through Rwanda, which is like a doorway to Congo. Habyarimana refused, so they plotted his overthrow. And they did to do that. They used the Tutsis in Museveni's Ugandan army, which made up about 1/3 of his army, to conduct an invasion of Rwanda in 1990. backed by Britain and the United States. If you've got time, we can explore the history of why the Tutsis were in Uganda at that time. There was up until 1959, the Tutsi aristocracy was a dominant force in Rwanda and ruled everything. The Hutus were kept down as serfs, basically. Only Tutsis could go to school and college. Only Tutsis could be in the army or the police and administration. But then a national liberation movement began among the Hutus, and they issued a manifesto in 1959 calling for equal rights and women's rights and labor unions and all sorts of things. So the Tutsis tried to suppress them, but the Belgians forced the Tutsi aristocracy to hold elections. So they first hold their first elections, and of course the Hutus, who were the majority of the people, won the elections and installed mayors and people in administration all over the country. The Tutsi aristocracy rebelled against that and tried to assassinate all those people. So the Belgians tried to hunt those people down, and they fled to Uganda. And about 100,000 aristocrats and their families moved to Uganda, vowing that they would never live in Rwanda unless they ruled it totally. And they ended up fighting with Obote, fighting for Museveni, and being mercenaries, then were incorporated into the Ugandan army by Museveni. But they always had the hope of restoring their monarchical power in Rwanda, and conducted raids into Rwanda in the 60s and 70s, which were all repelled, and then they finally petered out. And then Rwanda became quite a prosperous little country, which, because it has no resources, very, very tiny. It's mainly an agricultural society. But in the new republic, Tutsis and Hutus ruled together. There was no discrimination as such, though they alleged there was. But if you look at the history, it was pretty eclectic, equitable sort of country. And things were going fine till about 1990, when they decided to invade. And it was a surprise attack. The Americans took part by inviting Habyarimana to Washington on the day the attack took place. He was flown to Washington for a meeting, and that's when they launched the attack. And then the Americans asked Habyarimana to stay in Washington as sort of an exile, and hoped he would not go back, but he refused and went back. And that invasion was repelled. And then the Ugandan army, which was who most of these rebels belonged to, or so-called rebels belonged to, conducted the same sort of campaign that the Contras conducted in El Salvador. They sent in teams of men to murder Hutus, Hutu doctors. Any Hutu who was educated, any Hutu who had risen in the administration was murdered in brutal ways. They murdered peasant farmers to drive them out of the northern breadbasket. And over 4 years, this sort of guerrilla warfare, or terrorist warfare actually, took place where they attacked Hutus, murdered tens of thousands of them, drove 1 million in towards the capital. And it got so bad that the UN Security Council got involved, and they agreed to send in a peacekeeping force into Rwanda in 1993, headed by the Canadian General Dallaire. Now, then they negotiated a ceasefire and what they call the Arusha Accords, in which Habyarimana finally agreed to have a multi-party system and to accommodate some of these rebels who were then incorporated as locals. But all the time, the RPF, for Rwandan Patriotic Forces, who were the Tutsi forces backed by the Uganda, and every one of them was a member of the Ugandan army, began planning a final offensive, which took place in 1994. The UN peacekeeping force, which was sent in 1993, October of 93, was composed mainly, the main contingent was Belgian soldiers with Canadian officers. There were some Bangladeshis and Ghanaians. But it was the Belgians who were the main contingent. They quite clearly, as we proved in the trials, were supporting the planning of the offensive against the government and trying to overthrow the government, which took place in 1994. They were not neutral as it was supposed to be. They did not try and keep the peace as it was supposed to do. They were involved the entire time they were there, from October 93 through June, July of 94 in planning and working with the invading forces to overthrow that government. And that's what they did. On April 6th, the president's plane was coming back from a meeting he attended in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. It's quite clear he was lured there to get the plane to fly back at a certain route so they could shoot it down more easily. Missiles were fired at it. We know the Belgians were involved in that. The Americans, the Canadians were involved in that. So on that plane, they killed the head of state, the president. They killed the army chief of staff, several cabinet ministers, and several other senior officials. So it's a decapitation strike. And then they launched their offensive immediately that night. And they attacked across the country. The army was caught off guard, so much off guard that they couldn't even access their weapons because the UN peacekeeping force had made sure that all their weapons depots and ammunition and magazines were under seal and locked. So even though they were under attack immediately from the RPF forces, which were about 30,000 men, they snuck into the country. They couldn't even get their personal weapons. Anyway, they finally had to break into their own magazines and weapons depots to get their arms, and they were fighting on the back foot ever after that. They never seized the initiative because there was a surprise attack. The Belgians had held positions around the hills around the city of Kigali, the capital, handed them over to the RPF, and they put in heavy machine guns and Katyusha rocket launches, and they bombarded the capital 24 hours a day with Katyushas and heavy artillery and strafed the streets, and then began shelling the Nyachonga refugee camp just outside the capital, which had held 1 million people, all Hutus. They used high explosive shells for several days on that camp, killed thousands of people, forcing them to flee through the capital, which they wanted to use to disrupt the government and to infiltrate their men into the capital itself. On the 12th of April, the shoot-down took place April 6th. On the 12th of April, the government fled to a town further south called Gitarama. The army, several army officers, including my client, General Didiliamana, offered to surrender. That was refused. They could have stopped the violence right then and there, but they refused. And so the army and the gendarmes fought on as best they could, and they fought on until the very end. They did not give up. They held off the RPF in the capital. It was one of the great sieges of history, actually, the 3-month siege of Kigali. And you have battle reports of the officers that took part. It's pretty intense. And they only actually surrendered because they literally ran out of bullets, because they could not get any supplies, whereas the RPF was being supplied daily by flights from the Canadians and Americans and British flying planes into Kigali Airport, which they seized, disguised as humanitarian supplies. So they had all the weapons they needed, where the army ran out of hand grenades in, I think, 10 days, or had to make their own homemade explosives. They ran out of ammunition. The Belgians attacked them. They report Belgian UN armored cars were attacking them. In fact, the morning after the plane went down, the RPF forces hit the Army military police camp at a place called Kami, where 500 military police were stationed, and wiped them out in 2 hours. So they had no military police. They attacked all the gendarme camps, the national police camps in the capital, locked them down under bombardment continuously all the way through the rest of the war. At a place called Remy, they attacked the main gendarme camp there from the RPF attacked from the front, and soldiers reported that they were then attacked from the rear by the Belgian UN peacekeepers with heavy machine guns. So they were trapped and they were decimated. And that was the entire war. Yes, many thousands of people were killed, but most of the dead are Hutus, not Tutsis. There were only, in 1991, the last census was taken by the government, and the RPF never challenged this. There were 560,000 Tutsis in the entire country, 40,000 in Kigali. And yet they state that 300,000 to 400,000 people survived, Tutsis survived, which means that most of the 800,000 to 1 million people they claim dead, most of them are Hutus. In fact, Rwandan RPF officers told us that they think they killed 2 million Hutus in those 12 weeks. And Robert Gersoni, who was a USAID agent, was sent in June of 94 when the government army fled into the Congo. He filed a report with the UNHCR and the International Red Cross stating that the RPF forces were committing genocide against the Hutus for many months and were continuing to do it at the time he filed his report in October of 1994, because there were reports of tens of thousands of Hutus being killed by the forces that took over the government at that time. They were just murdering and burning their bodies. We have to understand that the United States wasn't just generally assisting the RPF, the invading forces, in general terms. They actually had men on the ground. Witnesses told us, prosecution witnesses told us in the trials that they saw at the RPF headquarters at Malindi 2 days before they began their final offensive. They saw American soldiers there. My general and others testified that they saw several times U.S. C-130 Hercules dropping men and supplies to the RPF lines after April 6. And there are other reports of them being involved. We know the Canadians and Belgians were definitely involved, but the American soldiers and forces were there, special forces. And that's replicated in Congo after the army fled intact. They retreated intact into the Congo, but were disarmed by the Congolese. 2 million Hutus fled with them to escape the massacres of the RPF forces. And in 1996 to 97, the Rwandans and Ugandans, with American and Canadian help, attacked those camps. They shelled those camps with high explosives, and after the shelling, they would have faced ground attacks and they murdered. We think, well, we don't know how many people were killed in the Congo, because they had to flee from Congo through to the west of Brazzaville. It's about 3,000 kilometers through the jungle and forest. Maybe 100 to 200,000 people were massacred, excuse me, during that trek. They reported that American spotter planes would fly overhead. They would see their markings, and then half an hour later, they would face a ground attack and an artillery attack, and then they would have to flee. Now, there were Tutsis killed in Rwanda. We don't know how many, because nobody's ever done a census. The present government refuses to do a census because it would reveal that most of the dead are Hutus. But there's no doubt Tutsis were killed by people reacting. Bandits killed people. Anybody who went into a village and was not known was assumed to be RPF and was killed on the spot. Bandits began killing Tutsis because they tended to be richer and steal their things. We had one man who killed some Tutsis who testified for us, a young man, and he said he had nothing against Tutsis. His girlfriend was a Tutsi, and in their village, they all got along well together until in May of 1994, they noticed April 21st, 1994, and this took place across the country. They noticed that all the Tutsis had suddenly disappeared. When they woke up and they found them in the local church, they went down to think, what's going on? And then people came and said, well, the RPF forces are coming, and they got a message to go into the church so they would know where they were so they can wipe us out. And so that made people angry. They began taunting the Tutsis, and the stones being thrown, and gunshots took place. Then people began killing each other. So it was not what you would call a genocide, because a genocide requires an intent to kill, an intent to wipe out people. It doesn't include people reacting out of fear or self-defense. And most of the killings were out of fear of what they thought the RPF and the Tutsis were going to do to them. And in fact, it's a very strange thing that the minority says they were wiped out, ended up taking power in 12 weeks and still there. And then there's quite a number of Tutsis. So you have to see Rwanda and Yugoslavia as pieces of the same thrust by the United States and its allies in the West to take over Eastern Europe, and control Central Africa, because Central Africa contains, as we all know, we should know, immense resources, mineral resources, timber, water resources, hydroelectric, oil and gas, you name it, Congo and the surrounding countries have it. And it was also a war by the United States against France, because the French were quite, as you know, involved in West Africa, Central Africa, and somewhat in Rwanda. The idea that the French had anything to do with the killings in Rwanda is ridiculous, because they were forced out of Rwanda when the UN peacekeeping force came in. The invading forces insisted the French force leave. So the French actually left. They had nobody in Rwanda when their final offensive took place. There was a UN peacekeeping mission sent in again in June and July, composed mainly of French, but they weren't involved in anything really except disarming Hutus. But the rumors were put out that the French were involved, and that's to distract attention away from the fact that the Americans were heavily involved. Boutros-Ghali, the UN Secretary General, told Robin Philpott, the Canadian historian, in 2004, that the Americans are 100% responsible for what happened in Rwanda, and I would say that's correct. Now, for those people who followed the trials at the Rwanda tribunal, you would know that almost all the allegations they made against the accused there were fabricated, every one of them. They fabricated. My man was faced with 45 counts of genocide, of massacres in this town, massacres by his men in this town, massacres by this town, and we proved none of them ever took place. We brought witnesses from those places. Those massacres never took place. And you might be surprised to know that during these trials, which took place over 15 years, they never showed any photos of any dead bodies to us. They never showed us any forensic evidence whatsoever. They never showed any videos of dead bodies. We never saw any evidence anybody had been killed anywhere, anytime. All we were faced with were prosecution witnesses coming in, and every one of them, I would say 99%, were Hutus, prisoners who were being held in detention in Rwanda, tortured, threatened with death, and told to come and tell stories. And several of them on the stand owned up and said, "We've been sent here to tell you stories." And what happened to those witnesses, we do not know. They're probably dead. But they were brave enough to say that that's what we were sent here to do. And it seems to be the same case at the ICTY. They made up the same allegations against Milosevic. Every one of them was proven to be false. And the same thing with all the other accused. But we have to understand that these ad hoc tribunals that the Americans arranged to have set up by the UN, and with the British and the Canadians and everybody, were set up in order to blame the victim for the war and condemn them as the aggressor and as the criminals, to deflect attention away from the true role of the West in these wars, and to cover up the crimes of the West in these wars, and put out a propaganda story to the people of the West, justifying these wars after the fact. And that's what they're for, and that's what they still do. But all of it was nonsense. All of it was lies, slanders, and that's why you do not see any reports of these trials anywhere in the Western media. In fact, when we were conducting these trials as defense counsel, we were very frustrated by the fact that because they had BBC people, New York Times people attending these trials, they only reported what the prosecution said, never what the defense proved. Mm-hmm. And do the same thing at the ICC now. But I can stop. I'm probably going on. I might ask some questions.
We'll take a brief break, but we'll come back with some more questions. You're watching Foreign Policy Review. Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University. Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Review. We have Chris Black today. He's an international lawyer. And we have Carlo Parcelli and Billy Bob on the show with us. So you guys have any questions concerning the material we were just presented with?
Well, I do. I mean, not necessarily. Well, with the material presented with, I do have two questions. I don't want to bog down the situation with them, but my interest is that the U.S. is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. Is that what it's called?
Right. Yeah.
But it still seems to me that they have an outsized influence in court, and even though they're not a signatory, and I wonder how that process occurs. I mean, do they use proxies to present their cases, or how does that?
I'll give you an example. That when I first arrived at the Rwanda Tribunal in 2000, I went into the administrative building to introduce myself and feel my way around, and I was met in the hallway by a very attractive, tall lady who asked if I was Mr. Black, and I said yes, and she said, "Well, I'd like to meet with you." I said, "Who are you?" And she said, I'm Patricia Wilderman. I'm Colonel Wilderman. I said, "Colonel?" She said, "Yeah, I'm a U.S. Air Force colonel. I'm in charge of prosecutions here." So that's who was in charge, not the UN. The U.S. military was in charge of that tribunal, the same as the Sierra Leone tribunal and the ICTY. Anyway, we had a meeting. She tried to browbeat me and into pleading my man guilty. He must be guilty, blah, blah, blah. I'm hearing some sounds there.
Apologize.
Okay. So anyway, it turns out that at every level, the prosecution was controlled by certain people from the United States, Britain, British intelligence, Canadian, American intelligence, military people. I was even interviewed by U.S. Army intelligence. I was interviewed there by U.S. State Department Research Intelligence Bureau. Tried to get information from me and intimidate me. The CIA many CIA people were there. I was threatened by them there. And when the ICC was set up, even though the United States took its signature off the ICC, the Rome Statute, they eventually signed, but then they withdrew it. The ICC, which is financed mainly by the EU, but managed to take all those people from the ICTY staff, prosecution staff, and administration staff, and the Rwanda staff, and they put them in key positions in the ICC. So these people are all connected to them. They're all allied with them. They liaise with them, and that's how they control the ICC inside. Even though they're not part of it, they control it completely. So you'll see the ICC has never arrested anybody except Africans, and only Africans who are against American and Western interests. They don't arrest Kagame, who has committed massacres on a scale unimaginable scale. That's how they control the ICC to date. So they'll make noises about investigating Americans' crimes in Afghanistan or American crimes here and there. It never goes anywhere. But they immediately jump on the bandwagon when they need to investigate Russian so-called crimes in Ukraine, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Is the U.S. they're not a signatory, and they've said that if they ever try and prosecute U.S. military people, we have the right to go in and militarily. Yeah, is that the ICC or is that a different court?
That's the ICC. That's the ICC. Okay. I think Senator Helms brought that statute into place. That's what their law says. That if any Americans are brought before the ICC, the American military go and rescue them and take them out of there.
It's basically might makes right, and international law is just a roadblock to overcome in pursuit of our hegemonic interests. Basically.
correctly.
And it's a weapon that we can actually use. We use to further our, because we use it against people who are impediments to us.
Yes, exactly. And that's they just ignore international law anytime they please, and they use it when it's convenient for them. That's how they work it. That's right. The same as the Cambodia tribunal. I mean, they charged Pol Pot with all these crimes, but the American bombing of Cambodia destroyed the agricultural system. Most of the deaths in Cambodia were from starvation because the American Air Force destroyed the agricultural system in Cambodia at that time, the Vietnam War. But these crimes are never judged by the West.
Yeah,
and they sort of talk about setting up crimes against Putin. I mean, it's just absurd, but this is the game they play.
Well, you answered my question about Putin and Ukraine. It's I don't think there's any kind of substantial argument that can be made that where you would look at the United States and say they're not involved in the same crimes as allegedly Putin is, whereas Putin and the Russians have a much more legitimate argument historically to do what they've been doing.
Right.
One of the questions I had was you seem to suggest that Osama bin Laden was not at the center of 9/11, and could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I was in Tanzania when that took place, and I was sitting in a bar. We watched it on TV, all these planes hitting the explosions and things. I was sitting with Italians, Germans, French, some Africans, some Brits. And we were all watching it. And then they claimed immediately that Osama bin Laden did it. And an Italian man said, "What a lot of bullshit. They did it to themselves." And everybody went, "Yeah, that's for sure." And nobody doubted that. Nobody. It was quite clear. and then when you realize that Osama bin Laden was one of the key allies of the Americans in Afghanistan to overthrow the socialist regime in Afghanistan for many years, worked with the American forces and army and special forces. And when Milosevic, and it was confirmed by Yugoslav intelligence to me also, that he was in Kosovo working under American army command with his jihadis trying to overthrow the Yugoslav government in 1998 and 1999. Well, it's just 18 months before it attacked New York, and being supplied with money and arms and weapons, and they were doing everything he wanted. Why would he suddenly attack them? But they turned on him and they used him as a scapegoat. And we know that when the American government shut down all air flights across the United States for 3 days after 9/11, there were 3 planes, or 2 or 3 planes, I think, were allowed to fly out of the country. They all contained members of bin Laden's family who were in Washington meeting with President Bush, because they're all shareholders in Halliburton together. Bush and bin Laden family probably are still shareholders. Instead of the family being kept there to interrogate them, where Osama might be, if they knew, and if he was involved, no, they let them go home to Saudi Arabia, but nobody else could fly. And nothing ever made sense. I mean, you look at there are many investigations by many, many people about what happened in 9/11, and the government narrative doesn't make sense whatsoever, and everybody knows it. Nobody can explain how building number 7, the 3rd building, suddenly collapsed, except it was, obviously it was rigged beforehand to blow up, and they blew it up. I mean, I suspect that the plane that supposedly crashed in Pennsylvania was one that was meant to hit that building, but didn't show up for whatever technical reason. So they had to blow the building anyway. So they did. And then you see what happened afterward. They immediately used that as a pretext to attack Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with 9/11. Never who did it. They had nothing to do with it. He was bin Laden of being there, and he was maybe there for a while, but then he ended up in Pakistan. And then they attacked Iraq immediately after that. So the 9/11 was used to get people all stirred up in the United States to support these wars against their own interests, and wasting money on these wars for the interests of other people, of the corporations that benefit from them. And you can't stir up people, most people are good people. They don't want to have a war and kill people, but you have to stir them up to get them to support war. And what better way than to conduct an operation like that to make people convinced they've been attacked. And they were attacked, but by forces more evil and dark than they claim. And we've been descending down that dark fascistic route ever since. And we now come to almost outright fascism in the West. What we see with what they're doing to Russia is almost incredible. About the sanctions, the economic warfare, and the threats of further warfare, and there's still risk of nuclear warfare. It's very dangerous, and these people seem to be driven towards it. And they've been on this course now for 20 years, and they seem to be intent on continuing it. And they don't care; they're ruthless. I mean, one thing you learn about these tribunals and how people act and how they react and who these people are, you realize that they are actually completely ruthless. They have no morality whatsoever. They don't care who gets killed or what they do as long as they get their way. They're almost psychopathic. I think they are psychopathic sociopaths.
And I'm in Washington D.C. and I kibitz with a lot of people, especially with the internet. And I try to express what you're expressing now to these people, and they simply don't get it. It's simply unfathomable to them. And we've seen how easily they've been turned against the Russians with this total propaganda campaign, with these false flags that are shot down in a day or two, over and over and over. I mean, do you think there's any kind of way that kind of propaganda barrage can be overcome? I mean,
it's difficult, but I mean, your program is very important, and other programs, independent journalists who are doing great work and courageous work. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. Really, compliment you on that. But it's very tough because we don't control the mass media, and you're right. It's same thing in Canada, and we saw that just a few months back, before they had this hue and cry against Russia, there was a hue and cry against China. That's being put on the back burner for now. But when Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Canada on American orders, the hatred in Canada, I'm not sure it's the same in the American media, but here in Canada, the propaganda against China was intense. And the hatred generated against Chinese here was intense. Now that's all put in the back burner. Now it's all Russians. Now you're supposed to hate all the Russians. And most people, I live in a small town now, most people here buy it. Everybody. It's almost, I don't think I could go out in the street and express my opinion here without my house being burned to the ground. Mm-hmm. That's how bad it's become here. It's you feel even intimidated just thinking what you're thinking, let alone speaking out about it.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it can be overcome because we realize that outside the NATO countries, Russia has support from all over the world, from Argentina, Latin America, Chile, Peru, Venezuela, Cuba. Most of the African countries support Russia, Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa, India, China, Indonesia, and even Turkey, which is a NATO member, is sort of sympathetic. So most of the world supports Russia. And you look at the Times of India, if you go outside, if people could read the Iranian press and Indian press and Chinese press, which I do every day, and the Syrian press, they'd find out that most of the world actually supports Russia and what it's doing and realizes why it's doing what it's doing. And yet nobody reports. Just 2 days ago, American helicopters, because the American army is still invading Syria. Nobody mentions the fact that the Americans are still invading Syria and Iraq, and there are daily attacks against American forces in those two countries to drive them out. Just 2 days ago, several American helicopters descended on a village near the city of Raqqa, which they completely flattened 3 or 4 years ago, and kidnapped several dozen women and children and took them away. obviously to hold hostage. I'm not sure why, but there were complaints. But locals were blocking American convoys from moving through the region, so that maybe they did that. I don't know, but that's what they've done. That's a war crime to kidnap women and children. But that's not mentioned anywhere. So, what can you say? I mean, we live in a very dark world. I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's encouraging to meet you guys. Really, so.
What about the economic dimension? The fact that the yuan and Putin's feint with the ruble, and that the countries are now willing to move away from the petrodollar. Do you think that has any legitimacy?
Yeah, I think. Well, if you've all read probably Michael Hudson's reports on this, I think he's correct that the United States and my country, Canada, Britain, the NATO powers, thought they really could control the world, and they've now boxed themselves into a tight corner, because by hitting Russia like they've done and forcing us back against the wall, they're now facing a reaction which they did not expect, consequences they did not expect. So instead of breaking Russia, they've made it stronger. Instead of economically ruining Russia, the ruble's gone up, and they're making more money than ever. And Russia now has become independent and doesn't give a damn about what the United States or Canada or Belgium or little Holland or Britain thinks about anything anymore. They're so frustrated and fed up with them, they say, to hell with them. We've got all the rest of the world supporting us. We don't need these small countries in Western Europe and Canada. What's Canada? So it's mainly the United States they're facing. But the United States now faces a situation where it's lost control of the situation. It's reacting all the time. It's not proacting. It's always reacting. And it's reacting in a very idiotic way, it seems to me, because they just made their enemy stronger and then driven China and Russia much closer together. So they're locked with North Korea, by the way, and Iran, and Syria, and Venezuela. And I think that they now, and with Saudi Arabia making noises that they're going to agree to accept yuan for oil from Saudi Arabia, indicates that America really is losing control of their attempts to gain hegemony over the world. That they crested, and now the American wave of power since World War II is receding quite rapidly, as we saw happen. You know, when I was born in Britain and raised there when I was a child, I was taught to be a proud British imperialist boy because the world was covered red with the British flag, and in 10 years it was all gone.
The butcher's apron, as the Irish call it, the butcher's apron.
The remaining 7 minutes or so, I just want to remind everybody that, and it's been a fascinating discussion, interesting. So, Billy Bob, Carlo, any questions?
How about, go ahead, Billy Bob.
It's just tremendous analysis, and I mean, I agree, 1000% with your perspective. I think, Carlo mentioned there was some news this morning about Africa. I forget what you had mentioned before the show.
The former president of Burkina Faso was convicted of murdering him and a number of Confederates of murdering Thomas Sankara, the Che Guevara of Africa.
I didn't see that this morning, but that's important news. I mean, Sankara was was another great African like Lumumba and Mandela and those people. Yeah,
it's about 20 years too late, or maybe more than 20, but.
Well, people remember Sankara very well, so that may, as we've seen, there's been overthrow of the French rule in Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad. So they're trying to push the French out of West Africa, and so that might solidify that.
In Mali, they kicked the French out, and the Russians came in, and a lot of them were with the Wagner group. They were mercenaries, but the Malis embraced them.
Yes,
the Malis, they were so grateful to be rid of the French.
Yeah. Well, I expect after if the Ukraine situation could calm down again, that release Russian forces, the next step may be to drive the Americans out of Syria once and for all. But they can't stay there forever. But I don't know, but that's what I suspect they might
Yeah,
do.
they're just occupying Syrian oil fields, making sure the government, the Syrian people can't benefit from those resources. It's criminal, like we've been saying all show. I think there's a lot of justification for optimism. I think the West is overextended, like you've said, and I don't think they can really compete with China and Russia together. I think Trump's strategy of being friends with Russia and trying to isolate Russia from China may have been a better move, but they weren't about to allow him to try and do that. It's weird. So they were forced on this. No, we're going to first take out Russia, then we'll take out China. Whereas Trump's strategy seemed a little bit smarter.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Trump, despite all his faults and problems, in that sense, had a better idea, much better ideas than Trump and Biden does, the Democrats. But I just saw a report. I'm glad you're optimistic. I'd like to be optimistic. I mean, we still struggle, and many groups around the world do. And Russia, and we're optimistic that China and Russia are resisting and fighting back. I think that is a positive thing. So yeah, maybe you're right. There's a lot of hope in the end. But Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence, said today that he suspects that the economic reality in Western Europe and the United States as a result of this war will lead to an outright dictatorship, fascist dictatorships in the West. That's a possibility. So that's something we have to be on guard against, because here in Canada, the feeling is really, really dark. I don't know what it's like in the United States. I mean, I watch American television and things, but I'm not living there. But here it's palpable. You can feel it in the air. It's very, very bad here. So I hope you're right.
Yeah, well, we have some cause for optimism and some for pessimism. It's a really tough situation and worldwide, and I'm all we can say is we hope that whatever struggle is going on, the powers of good will triumph, and that we'll be pushed back from our hegemony and whatnot, and then move forward from there. I don't know. I mean, it's really tough call.
Well, we thought that when all the guys remember very well the Vietnam. I was heavily involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement up here, because 100,000 Americans came up to Canada, and still 50,000 stayed and never gone back during the Vietnam War. Wow. That was very dark. We never thought we'd see the end of that, and that the Soviet Union collapsed. That was very depressing, but still things go on. So yes, I'm glad to meet people with more optimism than perhaps I have. I've maybe had too much experience. It's darkened my views.
Yeah. I mean, China for me is definitely, I have a lot of optimism in what they're doing. A lot of people on the left are anti-China. I think they're totally confused.
You're right. They're totally confused. I don't understand that feeling on the left. I mean, the real left, like the communist parties and the workers' parties around the world, all support China. But people that call themselves left here, like the New Democratic Party here in Canada, they're like social democrats. They've always supported imperialism.
Well, it's like I did a broadcast program with a young journalist from Somaliland, and Somaliland wants to be independent, an independent country, and certainly they more or less qualify, though I think as far as freedom of speech and freedom of the press, they lack some things. And the show never aired because I said it would be a mistake for Somaliland to lean toward the United States, and that what they had done in Berbera with the Deepwater port and the airport where the UAE, in conjunction with U.S. financiers, had said that the U.S. military would not be able to use that base. Then as soon as it was built, no, we're going to actually let the U.S. military use that base. And the destabilization that's going on by the U.S. in the Horn of Africa, but by and large, Somaliland I see is isolated in that regard. Obviously, even with all the destabilization that the U.S. has done in Libya and Sudan and South Sudan, and now they're attacking Ethiopia. And still Ethiopia, and they have the Belt and Road Project. They have that huge dam in Ethiopia. They're going forward with that project. Eritrea is staunchly anti-American. Somalia, they're Americans bombing them every day. Of course they don't like the Americans. I think internationally there is a consensus building that this has to stop. The U.S. has to be stopped.
Yeah.
With that said, we have just a remaining few seconds, so I'm gonna go ahead and close out.
Geez.
Yeah, we really got wrapped up in that discussion. Excellent. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today, and Carl.
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, quite all right. This has been the Foreign Policy Review, and I'm Dustin Pickering. We had Chris Black today, and Carlo Parcelli and Billy Bob joining with questions. So if you guys are watching Parrot TV, subscribe to our channel and keep watching the Foreign Policy Review. And later on today, we have the World Inkers Network coming up with an excellent guest. I'll surprise you with her. And if you haven't been doing any reading today, get some reading done and do some writing as well and get some thinking done. It's an excellent world, but it's a very difficult world. So without further ado, thank you for joining us today, everybody. Foreign Policy Review. World Inkers Monthly magazine is a fine source for your literary interests. It's an all-source magazine with poetry, prose, and essays and articles, as well as interviews. It's all full-color art and photography from a variety of voices and artists. You will find this magazine entertaining. This is an all-purpose readership, and we are looking for new voices. This sleek, full-color edition of World Inkers Monthly magazine will be something pleasant for your eyes as well as for your mind. And we're looking for authors for one book promotion in the magazine. If you're a business, we want to promote your business. You may submit your book reviews, your academic or non-academic articles on the humanities and the arts, as well as your literary writing and creative output to publication.worldinkers@gmail.com. World Inkers Monthly magazine does not spare any ink. Keep inking for World Inkers Monthly magazine.